It's my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. Joel Heck. As I mentioned on the first day, Joel is one of the three founders of the Society of Creation, yet he is truly the brains and the brawn of the organization. He has invested untold time, talents, and treasure to keep the Society of Creation going and vibrant. Dr. Heck earned his Doctor of Theology from Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. He was a colleague of mine here at Concordia University, Wisconsin, teaching theology. Before that, he was even a student here when Concordia University was first a gymnasium, a high school and two-year college. And after teaching here, I should mention he served in the parish for a number of years before this. But after leaving here, probably on my account, he went to Concordia University, Texas, in Austin, Texas, where he serves as professor of theology until I've just learned his imminent retirement from them. That's, yeah, oh, that is sad. Some things you don't know about Dr. Heck is he is a world-class table tennis player. When he was here, he used to challenge students and students, we're going to take this guy, especially our Asian students who are really good at what you Americans call ping pong. I'm not sure. Did you ever lose a game? Oh, okay. So he's Asian. So every once in a while, but in general, I still would not take him on to this day. Dr. Heck and his wife, Cheryl, have been married 46 years, I believe. Cheryl is told me she's going to her 50th high school reunion. I don't believe any of this. Nobody is this old to actually do this, but congratulations to them. In addition to his work with creation and in theology, Dr. Heck is also an expert on C.S. Lewis. He has one of his books out there. As a matter of fact, he just came up. We had Wheaton speaking on C.S. Lewis. Yeah. So just before he was speaking about his new book. So I encourage you to look that up. When you go to the Society of Creation website, societyofcreation.org, you have a link to your C.S. Lewis site there? You don't.
I should, yeah.
You should, yeah. But anyway, just search for Joel Heck and C.S. Lewis, and you'll find lots of interesting things there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Joel Heck.
Thank you very much. Exactly like I wrote it out for you. So we dive into a topic, going to explore something very different from what you've been hearing about baraminology and molecular biology and the like. A topic that I'm just beginning to delve into because I think it's really important how we communicate what we believe about origins with other people to persuade, to convince, to understand how people think and operate in this field. Years ago, the ICR used to do debates between creationists and evolutionary scientists. And I remember reading about a lot of that in Acts and Facts and some other places and silently cheering on the creationists. Because I guess if you talk to the creationists, then the creationists won the debate. If you had talked to the other side, probably you would have heard them say they won the debate. And so some of that is skewed a little bit by your perspective. Eventually, ICR gave up on those debates. One of them told me, because I think it was Tim Cleary, not because they lost, I don't think they did, but because they did not move the needle. So engaging in these intellectual battles, these struggles, these debates between evolutionists and creationists probably isn't the way for us to get the message out, to convince other people of the truth of the science and the theology that's so much a part of creationism. So the big question, I think, is how can we effectively use our time and energy? How do we go about communicating this truth? I mean, we do have a website, the Society of Creation website. That's one of the things that's out there. But how do we get people there? How do we get people to these conferences? How do we get people to engage the conversation? For years, probably about 15 years, I've invited a creation speaker to the campus of Concordia University, Texas, and invited anybody and everybody on the campus. I've had a very open policy to let people know that we are bringing in Georgia Purdom from Massives in Genesis, for instance, or Jay Siegert from the Wisconsin area, speaker after speaker, and telling the entire campus about it, publicize it, inviting creationists, evolutionists, anybody and everybody, including the students, to come and attend, and then allowing a Q&A session to happen at the end of that. So let the evolutionists bring their biggest guns, their best questions to try to shoot down the speakers, and none of that ever really happened. So that was one way to engage the evolutionary community, which it has a significant presence on our Concordia campus in Austin. So there are other things to be thinking about, but so there is some hesitance on my part, and I recognize that I'll say this again later on, that this is really more of a spiritual battle than it is a battle of evidence on one side or another. I hesitate to offer these remarks partly because this isn't my expertise. It is a passion, it is concern. So I have a bit of evidence to offer these remarks. I know of no adults who have changed their mind about evolution because of my use of the points I'm about to make. Most adults, it seems to me, are not willing to consider the alternative point of view. They filter everything they read on this subject through their lens of an evolutionary bias, be it Darwinian evolution or theistic creation or old earth creation or some other lens. And perhaps you've heard the rhyming statement that a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So that explains also why ICR decided to step away from the debates and use their time more effectively in other realms, other ways of communicating their message. On the other hand, it's not all bad news. And I suspect there's some testimonies in this group here, people who have been on the evolutionary side of things and have seen things differently as a result of a lot of the data that they read. I have heard testimonies in my tenure at Concordia University, Wisconsin or Concordia University, Texas, 24 years serving there, from approximately 100 students over the past decade who told me that they changed their mind about evolution because of what I had taught. So this happened especially in my Old Testament classes. And I would often hit the creation evolution story debate in the first unit of my Old Testament class. I mean, I'd covered the entire Old Testament, but it was in that first unit where we get into Genesis and Exodus, where I talked about creation and evolution and brought, for instance, a DVD with Kevin Anderson talking about soft dinosaur tissue and his research on the Triceratops horn. And so that was very fabulous. And so there were three different groups of students. There were they often never told me where they were coming from. Sometimes they did, but those that were committed to Darwinian evolution, what I wanted to do was to shake their world a little bit and help them to see there is another perspective. There were the young earth creationists who often feel put down as though they can't even say what they think. And so I wanted to embolden them, and I wanted them to feel confident that what they think is actually a legitimate perspective and actually the true perspective. But I was especially interested in those that are kind of in the middle. They're not sure what they believe. They don't want to throw their hat in one direction or another. Seems like the majority in their world is going with evolution, but they're really people who believe the reliability of the Bible. So they're thinking twice about it and they're not sure. And I wanted to be persuasive among them. And so it was in that middle group where about 100 students told me that, because I would ask on my first unit test, what one thing did you learn in this unit that especially impressed you or changed your mind about what you had previously thought? And every time I asked that question, I would have 4, 5, 6 students in a class of 30 to 40 who said, you know, I used to think that Darwinian evolution was the truth, and now I've changed my mind. And over the course of years, this is just my guess, maybe 10 students a semester, 15 students, 20 students a year, I would get those kinds of response from students in response to the question that I asked, and then cast this across a decade or a couple of decades of teaching, and that's how I come up with approximately 100 students. So they're especially in the impressionable years. They're impressionable in the direction of Darwinism, but they're also impressionable towards other points of view. And so I thank God for those 100 students who think a little bit differently, hopefully still the same way, as a result of having been engaged in some of the challenges to the Darwinian point of view, but also a positive presentation of creationism. So there is reason for saying what we think and attempting to convince people, even though to try to argue somebody into a position I don't really particularly recommend. So these three groups of people were in my students. They're also out there in the community. The young earth creationist who wants to know of others with similar convictions. So there's a significant benefit to us who are here this weekend. The undecided person who sees valid points on both sides of the question, and then the ardent evolutionist. And I told you the reaction I was hoping for from all three groups, but it's that middle group that I especially want to see recognize the validity of a creationary perspective. I'm also aware of the fact that probably you and I don't really convince anyone. When it comes to the truths of the gospel, that's the work of the Holy Spirit. And my job as a Christian witness is to get myself out of the way and allow the Spirit to do his work as people hear the truth of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And the Spirit does that work. And I think very often when it comes to discussions about creation and evolution, it operates very much the same way. The extent that the Spirit is involved in that, I don't know, but certainly to not be an obnoxious communicator and to turn people off and get people angry because of my style or my method of presentation. That's what I want to do. And I would like to allow the facts there to be laid out there and let people take a look at that data and be impressed by, for instance, by Matthew and Nathaniel's presentation of these topics. A lot of excellent information that I think has its own value and its own persuasive appeal. Evolutionists at Oxford University are in the majority at Oxford University, just like non-Christians are in the majority. My wife and I spent a sabbatical in Oxford back in 2004. I was studying the works of C.S. Lewis, and that's where he taught for 29 years. So it was great for me as a C.S. Lewis enthusiast and writer to be able to be in the midst of the Oxonians. And so at Oxford University, those that are in the majority get to decide a lot of things by majority vote. A Regius professor of divinity, so he was a clergyman, he was a pastor. In 2004, during that sabbatical, I was in one meeting where a presenter with a C.S. Lewis Society was talking about the significance of Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain. And in the discussion afterwards, he made this comment, and this isn't an exact quote, but it's the gist of what he said, that there are no creationists in the theology faculty of Oxford University. I don't know if he knew me or if he knew where I was coming from or if I somehow tipped my hand, but he made that comment. I didn't ask why, nor was I impressed with what he had to say. The implication is that the reason why they're in his implication, his thinking, the reason why there are no creationists there is because the evidence was weak. There's no reason to believe in creation, and that's what he suggested by his comment. The reality is that it's something very, very different. since they get to decide things by majority vote and they're already in the majority as the university is formed, they get to put together their search committees, their way of hiring new people, and they get to vote on different people. And if the majority of those who vote are evolutionists, they typically make sure that the people that are hired are evolutionists. And so they simply perpetuate that commitment. And that's the place where C.S. Lewis lived and taught, and why some of the positions that he adopts, like he believed that biological evolution was factual and true, but that's all he heard around him. Excuse me. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised that C.S. Lewis reflects some positions that I don't personally happen to hold. There's a new book just been released by James Prothero, who is part of a C.S. Lewis Society in Southern California. It's in California, it's either Southern or Central California. And what he says in this book about Lewis is part of what reaches people. And this really caught my attention. When academic and abstract argument fails, is the appeal to the imagination. So perhaps a talk on Christology, Prothero says, would cause most people's eyes to glaze over, cause them to pull out their smartphones to distract themselves. But to experience meeting Aslan in Narnia makes their hearts burn with joy. So one of the most powerful imaginative creations of C.S. Lewis is the Chronicles of Narnia and the character of Aslan, who serves as the Christ figure of those children's stories. So Prothero is talking about how Lewis has had a wide appeal to a wide reading audience. He goes on to say, Lewis is continually looking for the language we speak and speaking to us in that language. And when he meets resistance, he does not try to batter it or overwhelm it. Well, sometimes he does or did, but usually he doesn't or didn't. We are never made to feel stupid or evil because we do not agree. Lewis will anticipate the blockage and go around it. Another book that, the most recent book that I published last fall is called No Ordinary People. I'll show you a picture of the cover at the end of this presentation, where I looked at 21 different friendships that Lewis made with people in and around Oxford and at some distance. And some of those were people who thought very much like Lewis did. Some of those were people who were very, very different. Lewis was pretty much more of a theological and political conservative than liberal, although he's very hard to pin down. As Prothero says, he's kind of like trying to put a sunbeam in a bottle. That's the reason for the title of the book, which draws on a quotation from Lewis himself. But some of those were atheists before Lewis met them and after he met them, but some of them came into the Christian church as a result of the work of the Holy Spirit, but mediated through the life and the writings of C.S. Lewis. So he didn't care. He loved you. He cared about you if you agreed with him or if you disagreed with him. And so Lewis has some things, I think, to teach us about how to reach other people. Well, I also looked at the psychology of persuasion, some online resources, some people I talked to. Scott Adams is one of those. And as we talk to people about our convictions, he recommends communicate simply and clearly. That way it's easier to understand, it's easier to remember. So visual images, like some of these graphs in, what is it, R? Is that a particular computer language or a methodology of presenting your data is easier to understand and remember than some of the more technical things. He talks about persuasion talent stack, and I believe this is his reference to Donald Trump's reputation, his business skill, his negotiating skill, his sense of humor, being quick on his feet, etc. So this is piling one thing on top of another. He talks about using visual imagery. Trump's big, beautiful wall, and I'm sure this is Scott Adams or his private jet akin to Air Force One. For us, the double helix, the vast galaxies of space, the Creation Museum displays, the life-size replica of Noah's Ark, etc., etc. those visual images appeal to people far more than intellectual arguments. Robert Cialdini wrote a book called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. And actually, Bev Yankee, whom Gary knows, is one of the reasons why I thought about this topic, because she used to teach a course here at Concordia University, Wisconsin, on the psychology of persuasion during the January term, the winterim, they call it. And that course registered a full class within minutes of opening up registration for that January term. And so she taught the psychology of persuasion. And so Cialdini talks about reciprocity. People don't like to owe someone, so give them a gift, praise them, do a favor, and you build up a bank of social obligation that I think includes treating other people with respect and appreciating them, listening carefully to them. If you listen to their perspective, and Gary talked in the opening session, the welcome session, about understanding the other person's position. If you listen carefully to them and understand what they're thinking, they're likely to listen to you when you offer another perspective. Scarcity, the less there is of something, the more people want it. Limited edition, so you got to buy this thing. There are only 5 seats left for this performance. Or time pressure. In some ways, I feel like young earth creationists are a bit like this, although in the academic community that may be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to work when we communicate a science of creationism. Authority is a principle of persuasion. So having knowledgeable experts, people with PhDs in the various science fields, present at our conferences. And I don't know about you, but every year that we've had this being our 10th year, I've been impressed with the people that come in, every one of them with a PhD in a related field. And one of the things that I think Gary and I both have wanted to do is to bring in people who know their material and to present their material well, who have earned doctorates in their fields, and present information that can be trusted. So the status of the author, the amount of sales of a book on creation like Jonathan Sarfati's bestseller, some of the other books that they write and offer, those things give an air of authority and the reality of authority that we're hearing from people that really know what they're talking about. Too often creationists are presented as people who are a little bit muddle-headed in their thinking and don't know what they're talking about. And I don't think we've ever had a speaker here at any of our conferences who would fit that model, but have all been knowledgeable experts, maybe with except yours truly. So consistency, Cialdini goes on. People like to be consistent with the things they previously said or done. If I can get you to do some little thing consistent with your self-image, you're more likely to do it again. Grocery stores give out samples in the supermarket so that people maybe will buy that product. Having been created in the image of God is one of the most powerful theological truths that evolutionism downgrades our self-image. It says we're just nothing more than highly advanced primordial slime over the course of eons of development. And so the biblical perspective that you and I are really valuable in the eyes of God and are created in his image is one of the more powerful truths that we have available to us. And most people, even though we have a lot of negative self-talk, they want to believe the best about themselves and their potential. Likability. People are more easily persuaded by people they like. 1 Peter 3:15 talks about our witness being conveyed with gentleness and respect. So spending time with people as you get to know people can help you to become more persuasive with them. Friendship evangelism is much more effective to share my witness to somebody who knows me well than with somebody who is a complete stranger. So one of the reasons why being a witness within your circle of influence at work or in your neighborhood or in some other place where you frequently see people at their barbershop or the hairdresser, those kinds of places where they know you and you know them, that message of the truth of the gospel or truth about creation is much more likely to be well received. And that likability is one of the principles of psychology of persuasion. And I don't think you're reading me as saying, how can we manipulate people? This has to be a genuine appreciation of the other person rather than attempting to add a spiritual scalp or a scientific scalp to my resume. Social proof. When people are uncertain, they look to others to determine their own beliefs. And Matthew said something about that earlier. I'm going to draw on C.S. Lewis to illustrate this a little bit later also. Consensus, unity, conforming to a norm. This is a principle that works against creationism now. For example, 8 out of 10 guests reuse their towels, which is what the motel hotel will tell you, and in the hopes that they can conserve water, for instance, and maybe make it a little bit easier for the people that clean your room when you're staying in a hotel. Theistic evolution position is the consensus of the majority of the people in the world. Well, maybe not. I don't know. Gallup does these annual surveys, and there are a lot more creationists out there than the mass media would give you the impression that there are. A lot of evolutionists are atheists, so this is the opposite of the principle of scarcity. Anybody ever read Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People? I've done that. I haven't done it recently, but I've read it a couple of times. Some very powerful truths about how to relate to other people, reflect on that likability principle, the gentleness and respect principle of 1 Peter 3. So Carnegie says, mirror the other person's body image. So if the person is kind of leaning back, you lean back. If the person is focusing on your face, you focus on theirs. If they sit, you sit. If they cross their legs, you cross your legs. That's a good principle. Again, not in a manipulative sort of way, because Carnegie is really strong on being genuinely interested in the other person. And not only that, but when we talk to people, to be able to remember things that they said early in the conversation, to repeat back later on in the conversation, is going to show that you really did hear them. That's not easy to do. And I can't count the number of times I've been embarrassed by asking a question in a conversation that they answered earlier, if I had only been listening well enough to hear and retain. Because most of the time, when we're in a conversation, what are we thinking about? What I'm going to say next. And then we lose what they're hearing, what they're saying. To nod while listening to the other person, to do them a favor. That's that principle of reciprocity that we saw earlier. I'm not sure how this relates to convincing people or persuading people of the truth of creation. But this is one of the positive ways in which to build a relationship. Compliment sincerely while smiling. Sometimes my wife asks me if I found my smile yet today, because she hasn't seen one. So here it is. But to offer other people compliments, or to, especially if they're an evolutionist, to affirm something that they're saying that you can actually agree with, something that really is true. Tell the truth. So for instance, natural selection is a fact. Also true that the cloud canopy theory of the pre-flood world is not held by most creationists. Yeah, that's true. I remember reading Jerry Coyne's book. Was it you that, Nathaniel, that mentioned Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True, or something like that? One of the evolutionists on our faculty recommended it to me, because I asked, oh, what is a book that really presents the evolutionary perspective well? I wanted to see the argument for evolution as evolution in its most powerful form. So she recommended that, and I read it. and I noticed a few straw men that he erected and shot down. And I noticed a significant lack of scientific evidence in that book. And so after I read it, I talked to her and I said, you know, this is really the best case presentation of evolutionary theory. I'm a bit surprised, and I mentioned a couple of things I've just shared with you. And well, yeah, I guess it really isn't all that good. But when I asked her for the best option, that was what she gave me. So I'm a bit surprised, but sometimes they have their heads on straight. In fact, my book, The Story of C.S. Lewis, his journey from atheism to Christianity, a couple copies out there. Based on that, I'd love to have the opportunity to speak to an atheist group on things that atheists get right. Because Lewis himself was an atheist, and when he fought in World War I, and he made the comment later on that I never stooped so low during the war as to pray. And so the whole comment that there are no atheists in foxholes, that's not really true, because he definitely was one. And so we want to make sure that we don't offer things that really aren't accurate. So atheists do get some things right. Typically, when an atheist adopts atheism, there is a certain sense of relief, because at that point they believe they're not really accountable to some omnipotent God who is going to someday judge them. Now they're wrong, they are accountable to him, but they've come to a position of emotional release where they feel relieved that they don't have to worry about that anymore. So, and there are other things that they're concerned about, such as the environment or animal cruelty that we can agree with, even if we don't go as far as they go on that particular topic. The build rapport, this is that principle of friendship. As you build rapport, you earn respect. You earn the right to be heard if you're really listening to them when they speak. Tell a secret. I'm not sure how this fits into creation evolution conversations, but especially if it's a true secret, something that people don't know. Maybe if we define secret widely enough, there are some things that we can learn from that. And to communicate clearly and simply, the Scott Adams principle number 1. Be charismatic by showing certainty and telling stories. This is Dale Carnegie. So I got to share with you the Locklear principle. Did you know there was a Locklear principle when it comes to the psychology of persuasion? Well, there is. Present positive examples of creationary evidence rather than attack the weaknesses of the other side's arguments. I think that's an excellent principle. We need to be known more for what we believe than for what we reject. There are plenty of weaknesses in the evolutionary side of things, but to be positive, and that's been generally the rationale behind these conferences, is to not hold up all kinds of evolutionary thoughts and shoot them down, but to present positive evidence for the creation. You can probably add to the list of principles for engaging people thoughtfully, especially those that have not seriously entertained the possibility that evolution is a myth. I recently wrote a farewell email to the entire campus community in Austin. And it was a lengthy email, but I made mention of the Darwinian myth, and I probably offended a couple of evolutionists, but I do think of it as a myth, and that's my conviction. Biblical principles of persuasion. There's probably a lot more passages that we could draw on, but a lot of these will echo things that I shared with you a little while ago. Proverbs 16:21, the wise in heart are called discerning, and pleasant words promote instruction. Again, to be positive in what we present rather than negative in what we're against. You need to have a little bit of that, because there are weaknesses in the evolutionary position, but especially to be positive and pleasant in what we teach. 3 verses later, pleasant words are honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. So the ability to tell stories and to offer images is an excellent biblical way of teaching. And this is the full verse. It has to do with Christian witness. 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And he's thinking especially about the message of the gospel, the forgiveness of sins, eternal life, a place in heaven one day. But I think it applies equally well to conversations between creationists and evolutionists. But do this with gentleness and respect. And respect allows the other person to walk away. Respect doesn't allow my personality or my anger or my emotion to get in the way of communicating what I sincerely believe. Galatians 5:22, if the Holy Spirit lives within us and we are communicating, then our demeanor ought to reflect the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and the one that's most often forgotten and often in short supply, self-control. Come back to a comment I made earlier, and I think it was Matthew that shared in conversation as well as in one of his presentations. Lewis says in his book, Mere Christianity, one of his 3 most well-known writings, Chronicles of Narnia, Screwtape Letters, and this one, Mere Christianity, he makes a comment that 99% of all that we believe is believed on authority. So he says, and I quote, 99% of the things you believe are believed on authority. I believe there is such a place as New York. I've not seen it myself. I could not prove by abstract reasoning that there must be such a place. I believe it because reliable people have told me so. The ordinary man believes in the solar system, atoms, evolution, and the circulation of the blood on authority because the scientists say so. Every historical statement in the world is believed on authority. Have you ever read a book about the Reformation era of the 16th century, or about Isaac Newton, or anything that you did not personally experience and live through, anything from before the beginning of your life and your conscious existence? Everything historical about the American Revolution. The book I read while we were in Cincinnati for a few months on this, I'm actually on an academic sabbatical till the end of June, so I have less than 1 week of service on the university at Concordia University, Texas. So read that book about John Adams' life as a biography, and that was all written on authority, and I believe it on authority, so very accurately written by David McCullough. So that's why a lot of people believe in evolution, is because most of the people around them believe in evolution, and people they respect, people with advanced degrees, and they don't know too many people like Matthew and Nathaniel. One of the books I also read while on sabbatical by a guy named Preston Sprinkle talked about Dr. Jonathan Haidt, one of the world's authorities on moral theory. Never heard about this guy before, and I haven't read his book, but Jonathan says after years of studying why good people disagree on core moral and political issues, he learned that people typically believe certain things because they first want to believe them. One of the reasons they want to believe them is because they don't want to swim upstream. They don't want to be sitting on an island. They don't want to be the only one who thinks this way. I know a young man who said, everybody around me believes in evolution, so I guess I do too. So he wanted to be accepted. In fact, he probably told people what he believed. He might have been asked about the topic of creation and evolution, and he said what he thought, and then found out that he was mocked or ridiculed, and everybody else in the room had a different opinion. And of course, he lives in California, where there are probably a lot more people on the left side of this issue than most other states in the Union. And so Jonathan says, desire precedes belief. Fascinating to me as I thought about this. He says it also precedes evidence. Only after believing it do they look for rational reasons to support their belief. Remember reading, I don't know if it was Leadership magazine years ago or some other magazine, but I saw a cartoon where a young man is on the floor and he's got a book open on the floor. He's lying flat on his stomach and he's paging through this book. It's the Bible. And his wife asks him what he's doing. He says, I'm looking for a verse to support one of my preconceived ideas. And that's how sometimes we look at the Bible. We decide what we believe, and then we look for passages to support it, which is actually the opposite. My doctorate is in exegetical theology, and exegetical is a fancy word, the adjective form of the noun exegesis, which means to lead out. To lead out of the text the meaning that's there, rather than to read into the text the meaning I want to find. And when people do the opposite of exegesis, that's when we run into a wide variety of differing opinions, different beliefs, because they've already made up their mind before they come to the text what they believe. And now I got to figure out how to make this text agree with, support the position that I've already held. So this isn't just in science and evolutionary versus creationary thinking. It's in most areas of life when it comes to, and he's looking at politics and religion, but it applies across the board, I think. So after I believe something, which I believe because I want to believe it, then I look for reasons to support it. It's not rational arguments that are the primary support for their belief. So that's another reason maybe they didn't identify this kind of thinking when ICR decided to set aside the debates, but probably experientially it was one of the reasons. It's the desire to believe the thing in the first place that leads them there. So this is the title of the book. Like I said earlier, I haven't read the book. I've only read one author's understanding of the book, and he's dealing with people's viewpoints on sexuality and marriage as he applies this. But this is, I think, worth reading for anybody that's interested in moral theory and wants to delve further into what Dr. Jonathan Haidt has to say. The righteous mind, why good people are divided by politics and religion. I remember C.S. Lewis studied with a tutor by the name of William T. Kirkpatrick, who was an atheist and probably gave Lewis some additional ammunition for the atheism he espoused at that point. But Lewis was also already an atheist when he came to study with Kirkpatrick. Kirkpatrick had a sharp mind, but he used to say, I have no opinions on any topic whatsoever. He doesn't have opinions or even convictions, which would be strong opinions. He simply believed truth and he shared it with people. And if they disagreed with him, well, you were wrong. I guess that's how Kirkpatrick thought. But that's a kind of an extreme version of a person who wasn't even aware of the fact that he desired to believe certain things, that he became an atheist, and then looked for support for that belief, even though he thought it wasn't an opinion at all. It was simply the truth. So C.S. Lewis explains why people believe in evolution. Because most other people do. But also because of the appeal to autonomy. Lewis says he was an evolutionist at first because it provided him an escape from an all-seeing God. And he also spoke against developmentalism, which he distinguished from biological evolution. He thought we evolved from single-celled organisms, but the whole idea that the world is getting better and better and constantly improving, he spoke out against it. He had some serious criticisms of developmentalism, which he distinguished from biological evolutionism. So he wasn't hook, line, and sinker in the evolutionist camp. In fact, he believed in a historical Adam and Eve, for instance. So there's some, I think, somewhat inconsistent positions that he held. He also held that position because that's all he met in Oxford. I told you a little bit earlier how Oxford hired its faculty, and the people around him were evolutionists. And so he bought into that because highly educated people, very intelligent people held to that position, and that's all he met. But he held a number of other inaccurate positions because that's all he saw around him. The belief in the story of Darwinism is often an attempt to avoid coming to grips with God and my sin. There's a better way of dealing with it, and that's to admit it. I am a sinner. The example of C.E.M. Joad, who I wrote about in my book, No Ordinary People, he once admitted in print, I cheat the railway company whenever I can. And he got caught riding on a train without a ticket, and it ended up doing significant damage to his career, which helped him to see that evil is not just out there. And he saw that during World War II and the evil of Nazism and the attempt to exterminate, to commit genocide against the Jewish people. But he also came to see that evil is in here. At some point in our conversation with a non-Christian, we could ask, what do you think of Darwinian evolution? Do you agree with that theory? And if they do, then another question should or could follow. Is there any chance that accepting the theory of evolution provides you with an excuse for avoiding talk about God, sin, and eternity? Because most of the time, I don't like it when you point out my flaws. I mean, you're not so holy yourself, right? Our first reaction is to strike back, and it makes us uncomfortable. But a real dealing with the problem of sin in here is what I need to do, what law and gospel does for me, and also brings that positive message of forgiveness. But most people have that kind of a knee-jerk reaction unless they've trained themselves to hear criticism positively. Proverbs 9 says, instruct a wise man and he will be wiser still. Rebuke a fool and he'll reject you. So wise people can hear the criticism, even if some of it is unjust, and try to understand what is the kernel of truth in that criticism. And sometimes it's entirely true. So I need to not have such a thick skin that I can't hear a legitimate piece of criticism and accept that which is true. So one approach, present the exegetical case for a natural reading of Genesis 1. Fine, but not convincing to one whose mind is made up. Here's another approach. How do you prefer to think of yourself? As a person whose existence is the result of long eons of time after a huge explosion, pure chance, the rarest of coincidences, and a string of improbable mutations? You like that picture of you? Hugely advanced primordial slime, or a child of God made in the image of the King with a divine and eternal purpose? Now, which of those two perspectives is the nobler perspective? No wonder that there's a lot of nihilism, that there are a lot of people who think that there's no purpose in life, that suicide rates are on the rise. If they're told that they're junk, that they're primordial slime, that they're not much more important than dirt, well, then there's no surprise that they act in accordance with that self-image. But we have a very, very powerful message, and I really believe that Genesis 1 and 2 teach a 6-day divine creation out of nothing in the relatively recent past, thousands of years ago rather than billions of years ago. But I also think that another truth out of Genesis 1 that we need to emphasize is this creation in the image of God. In other words, which do you prefer? And it would be good to present that in conversation. Instead of proclaiming what we know to be true, we can ask questions of other people, what they think, what they believe, and be good listeners. Why is it that many people go to bat for endangered species? Central Texas, it's salamanders, the golden-cheeked warbler, or the vireo, whose ability to protect themselves is limited, or participate in the SPCA, or beg people to adopt an animal, but think that they are the product of time, chance, and random mutation with no purpose in life, but they have purpose in going to bat for endangered species. Did you know that Jesus was constantly doing two things in his earthly ministry? And I think we can learn from the example of Jesus. You know what they were? Asking questions. He was teaching, but how was he teaching? He was asking questions and he was telling stories. All the parables are stories. And there are something like 153 questions. If you total all the questions that Jesus asked in the four Gospels, well over 150 questions. So if the master teacher was constantly doing those two things, might it be wise for us to imitate him? Also, when it comes to talking about creation evolution. So the art of asking questions applied to the creation evolution debate. Why is it that the evolutionist often doesn't go to bat for the most defenseless among us? And who is the most defenseless among us? But the unborn child, his mother thinks of that child as an expense, an inconvenience, or a mere product of conception. Talk about euphemisms. There are advantages to asking questions, by the way. It takes more time. That's, I guess, the disadvantage. It gets the other person talking. It often exposes the source of authority for the other person's position, especially if you're listening carefully and asking more questions. You then get to ask about the reliability of that person's source of authority. Is it just what they think? Is it what they heard on the 6 o'clock news that night? Is it just what you were taught in school but have a little basis for it? Is it a book you've read, some piece of scientific evidence, or something else? So where do you get the confidence that what you just shared with me is true? Often when people have to think about their source of authority, they see the flimsiness of that authority when they have to name it. Another advantage is that it keeps you from being accused of ramming an idea down someone's throat. I'm just asking you a question. It respects the opinions of the other person. Do this with gentleness and respect. It allows the other person to walk away. It shows your open-mindedness. And there are probably other advantages to asking questions. By the way, this PowerPoint is going to be uploaded onto the website of the Society of Creation. So if you want to see or use or reuse any of this, you want to download the PowerPoint and adapt it for some purpose of your own use, you'll be able to do that within a week of this conference. In other words, can we try talking about the implications of a set of beliefs rather than the evidence for a set of beliefs? Can we speak, and not, I shouldn't say rather than, but maybe in addition to the evidence? Can we speak to the hearts of people rather than the heads of people, to their consciences rather than exclusively to their intellects? Another question, I once asked an evolutionist this question: what do you consider the strongest piece of evidence for Darwinian evolution? I'd love to ask 100 evolutionists this question, but then listen to what they say. So they got to tell you what they think is a powerful argument and what they base that on. I asked this question, and very relevant to this conference. He told me that wide variety of species could not have developed in only a few thousand years. And we heard that partially addressed, I think, by Matthew when he talked about the post-flood world where there are ecosystems that had no creatures in them. So there was tremendous amount of room to expand and relatively little resistance to that. That's one answer to the question. Another answer, I think, is the powerful genetic information that got built into the genomes of every human creature. So in my opinion, the three strongest arguments for creation fit into these areas: soft dinosaur tissue, the complexity of DNA, which boggles the mind to think that people believe that DNA came together out of random chance, long periods of time and accident. Carbon-14 testing, another very, very powerful argument. There are probably many others, but each of these areas is an argument both for creation and against evolution. So I got to wrap things up because we want to take a few minutes for some Q&A or discussion. Arguing has little effect upon the person. As I said earlier, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. And in these days of gender equality, we can say a woman convinced against her will is of the same opinion still. We're equal in that regard. We need to think about other tactics, especially the appeal to autonomy or my desire to be my own person. We are in a spiritual battle far more than a battle over evidence. I wouldn't say it's not at all about evidence, but this is a spiritual battle. Paul tells the Ephesians, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And if we think of it only as a matter of evidence, we miss out on a significant part of the disagreements that we have with the evolutionists. So I've got 2 slides about books. I brought 9 copies of this book, published in 2011 and still selling several hundred copies a year. It's 80 pages. It's out there on the table. It's $5 for a book. And it is a look at the first chapter of Genesis from the perspective of the creation evolution debate. And these are the 2 books by Lewis. I was bringing both of them along and sold half of the copies of the one on the left, the other half, the other 3 copies are out there on the table. No Ordinary People. That's what I was lecturing on, was that book that was published last October, 21 Friendships with C.S. Lewis and how he elevates the status of each individual. And if you want that book, you'll have to, I guess, order it from Amazon or Barnes and Noble online. So from atheism to Christianity, the few copies I've got here, I know a couple of you already have it and have read it. It's $15 and the other one is $5. And so the one, No Ordinary People, from Winged Lion Press in New York, you'll have to, or if you want that, I mean, I know this is we're in a creation conference, but I did draw on Lewis significantly to prepare this talk. So that brings me to the end of this presentation, and I thank you for your kind attention and ready to handle a few questions and maybe
Can we start with a question from online? Why are the San Francisco Giants a better team than the Los Angeles Dodgers?
I can't imagine who might have asked that question. Why? Last year they did beat the Dodgers out for the division crown by 1 game after, what is it? The Dodgers had won the West Division 8 years in a row.
Moving on now.
Okay.
Dr. Heck, I didn't mention, is a big baseball fan. So I grew up in Northern California, and but you have been to all major league parks, haven't you?
Yes, all 30 major league ballparks to see a game, not just to tour the facility, but to see a game. And when you go to Candlestick Park for a Dodger Giants game, it's an amazing number of Giants jerseys and Dodger jerseys, more Giants, of course, but it's a huge rivalry, one of the top rivalries in sports. And for the most part, probably 98% of them get along. Sometimes you have a husband and wife combo, and she's wearing the jersey of one team and he's wearing the jersey of the other team. So it is possible. And, we are friends. We are still friends, aren't we? Yeah. So that proves that people who have very different allegiances can get along, as does the book of Ordinary People.
Candlestick Park don't count anymore. That don't exist.
That's true.
Yes, they tore that down.
Have you been at the new one?
I've been to the new one. Joe Montana made some disparaging remark about Candlestick Park because of the winds that swirled around there and
Wet field, it's
It
a
was-
miserable place to.
yeah, and in fact, it was being planned for a housing development in sort of a city within a city. I think Joe Montana said something, former quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers who played football in Candlestick. He said, the land is now being put to better use than it ever has been, or something to that effect, that he didn't appreciate having to play in Candlestick.
One of the last games played there, Packers 49ers playoff game, the power went out.
Oh,
yeah. Remember that?
I'll do one more from online. If you don't want to respond to this, we can funnel off somebody else. One of your arguments, powerful arguments, how is carbon-14 dating a powerful argument in favor of creation?
Yes, I'd be happy to address that. Maybe others want to chime in. The RATE project, Radioactivity and the Age of the Earth, sent coal samples to the Accelerated Mass Spectrometer at Vienna, Austria, to be tested for the presence of carbon-14, because if coal is over 100,000 years old, there should not be a single molecule of carbon-14 detectable. And after 200,000 years, there shouldn't be any in existence. All of these coal samples from the Penn State University Coal Bank range in age, according to the evolutionary time scale, between 30 million and 300 million years old. And so none of them should have shown any evidence of any carbon-14 molecules. And yet they all came back showing appreciable amounts of carbon-14 in those samples. And believe it or not, they were all roughly the same amount of carbon-14, which shows that the 300 million year old coal wasn't 10 times as old as the 30 million year old coal, but they were in the thousands of years old rather than the tens of millions of years old. And every fossil sample, I think Matthew said earlier that fossils typically are shown to be young rather than old when they are subjected to testing. They have soft tissue that can be studied under a microscope. The dinosaur fossils from Hell Creek, Montana have shown blood vessels and blood cells. So carbon-14 is far more a friend of creation science, it seems to me, if you look at the data objectively. Yes.
Regarding aging, as long as we're on that, what do most creationists think the age of the earth is? I tend to think that the model is 6 to 7,000 years.
Yeah,
I've heard some people say 10,000.
6 to 10.
Question on the age
Yeah.
of the earth and the creation model.
What do most creationists think? 6 to 10,000. There's some possible evidence from the biblical narrative where there are genealogies that may have been some gaps in the genealogy. I know that our third co-founder, Andrew Steinman, has written extensively. He's at Concordia University, Chicago, about the genealogies. He's young earth creationist, but he says he thinks there are some gaps in there, but not enough gaps to extend the age of the earth to hundreds of thousands of years old. So yeah, 6 to 10. Matthew, and then.
Okay, so do you think that at some point American society might become believe in creation, young earth creation as a majority?
Do you think that American society in the future may accept young earth creation?
If it were,
Like in the majority?
yeah, if it were purely a matter of scientific evidence and not a spiritual battle, I think there is a chance that that would happen. I haven't looked at the Gallup poll results lately, but they do that almost every year, don't they? And there are a lot more young earth creationists than, I mean, there seems like they're declining in percentage, but there are a lot more young earth creationists than I ever thought. So I doubt it, simply because of my lack of confidence in a corrupted human nature. So when Lewis says developmentalism has gone astray, the one doctrine, biblical doctrine that is objectively verifiable is the doctrine of original sin. That's what G.K. Chesterton said and what Lewis affirmed. But yeah, people are corrupted and they don't want to believe sometimes what the evidence is telling them.
One never knows though, because look at Roe v. Wade. I never would have thought in a million years that would have been over.
Yes, yeah.
In my lifetime.
Nobody ever is going to beat Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak.
Or the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Then again, you never, yeah, there are surprises. So God is a God of surprises. Let's pray for that day. Let's say that.
I think it was C.S. Lewis said that 99% of what we believe is what we've been told. My question is that percentage high?
Oh, okay.
Question is, when Lewis said 99% of what we believe is what we've been told, is that percentage high enough?
Yes, probably not. Most or all of us came to a point in life where we asked ourselves, I know I did, do I believe what I believe simply because my parents told me this, or because I'm convinced that it is truth? And I went through that, and it didn't take me long, but I did come to that position. Yeah, I believe that this is truth, and we always got to examine our evidence, our data, and for me as a theologian to look at the scriptures, am I understanding any given passage correctly? But yeah, it may well be higher than 99%, because if you think of all the history, for instance, that we've read and are familiar with, what percentage of human history and worldwide human history have we actually personally experienced? Far less than 1%. So it's probably higher than 99%. Yes.
Another question. One of the arguments I was thinking, one of my ideas is that most of the arguments between people is because of differing assumptions. And I think that one of the things we need to do is the question, why do you believe what you believe? Where is the source, the authority for what you believe?
Often in my Christian witness, when I've talked to people who left the church, used to be a part of the church, if they're not in the church, I ask them, were you ever? And then listen to that. And then when they say, yes, I used to be a Baptist, a Catholic, or whatever, why did you leave the church? And listen carefully to what they have to say. And then to ask another follow-up question, what would be most likely to influence you to, having dropped out of the church, to drop back in the church? And to get them thinking about that possibility, and on what basis would they set aside this negative experience that they had with some Christian, some clergyman, some individual who offended them, and set that aside, forgive, and come to a position where I can now benefit once again from the ministry of the Word of God. And most people have never been asked that kind of question. So for us to ask the evolutionists why they believe what they believe, or what they think is the most powerful piece of evidence for evolution, and on what they base that, those are questions that I think we need to ask a lot more and be good listeners, like you suggest.
One more question. Oh, two more questions.
And we'll wrap it up.
Thank you.
Well, first,
Yes.
just a brief comment. There's a phrase I heard and it resonated with me that fit under your moral authority section, and that is the phrase conclusions in search of reasons.
Yes.
It just seems like it says it well. And of course, I still see that in my own life, right? Because at a point in life, you believe something, and it's like, well, why do I really believe it? So you have your conclusion, you go looking for reasons to have some ambition, but sadly, I wonder if how many people even have the ambition to go search for the reasons.
Yes.
Go along through that. I want to go back to early in your presentation. You mentioned 100 students roughly that you thought you had made an impact on. Could you elaborate a little more on where they were in life, where your assessment is of their background, and
Yes.
did they come through with kind of a general Christian background, but never hearing a good presentation of evidences? Or
Most of our students are Christians, probably more conservative Christians. You know, the traditional age student, 18 to 21, roughly in that range. And they probably had high school teachers who weren't all that well trained in science, but who assumed evolution was true and then taught as though it were. But the teachers had other goals than to become an advocate for Darwinism. And so they didn't get into that a lot very deeply. And so the students felt the pressure of their peers and the authority of the teacher. And so they assumed that was true. Maybe it was a shift from what they had believed earlier. But I know Ken Ham has done a study of, I think it's a book called Already Gone, that shows that it's not really so much the university that causes people to leave the church, but the seeds of their departure are sowed a lot earlier, some at the elementary level, some at the high school level, and much less at the college level. So churches that don't do an awful lot of teaching and discipling with the scriptures, and it's easy for us to say have a one-day class to join the church. So come and sit with us for a few hours, and then you'll know everything you need to know about the Bible. Not really true. The attitude that confirmation is graduation. So once I've been confirmed, if I'm in a church that practices confirmation after 8th grade, I know all that I need to know. So I've graduated, and to be involved in the continuous study of the Bible is foreign to them. So we've got to turn that around. But if they come from a church that's not much of a Bible teaching church, that sets them up for that. But most of them are Christians. Few are ardent evolutionists, and that's probably the reason why I get an occasional complaint in student evaluations that now this guy is rude, and I just don't do rude. So they're cloaking a deeper reason, because they didn't like the fact that I taught young earth creation as truth, instead of saying, what do you all think? Because there are all these opinions out there, and whatever you believe is fine with me. That's the way the world operates. So one last comment or question?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a somewhat heterogeneous collocation of thoughts here on my part, but I guess to put what you're saying together, I hear you kind of leaning into the ethos and pathos Aristotelian categories of persuasion a little bit, not denigrating, not taking away the logos part, but just realizing that, I mean, as created human beings, we have emotions, we have experiences. Those are powerful things.
Wow, I've never been described as an Aristotelian, but
Yeah.
I can wear that label.
It's I guess on the other side, it's a little bit hard as an academic and as a professor to kind of hear that, because obviously we don't want to give up on sort of the logos piece. I was just thinking about myself teaching Bible, and that one of the things that I say, because we're getting again a more and more diverse population of undergraduate students that are coming in, less and less Christian, I would say in some ways. But I talk about, sometimes to use a science metaphor, like classroom is the lab in a sense. And I think Concordia presents a unique opportunity for them to sort of be confronted with the text as you're kind of talking about, and ask questions about it. And I think people are less and less able to deal with the data. Like you said, they want to just have these ideas, or they don't even know how to ask questions about the text. But I think just getting them into, before we criticize, I guess here's another thing I would say on the logos piece. Like, I think in society, people are so conditioned to, we already know what we want to believe, right? Or what we feel, we want to justify that. But like, what does the text actually say? Like, what is the evidence of the text? And let's, again, classroom is the lab. Let's sort through that. Let's experiment on that. Pretend, at least to use a literary phrase, for the willing suspension of disbelief, which constitutes avoiding faith. Like, let's at least assume, even if you don't believe that this is true, and how does it work on its own terms? Before you bring your life experience into it, before you bring other problems or criticisms of it, let's sort it out on its own terms. So I think there's a lot more logos type training of the mind that we need to do as well, focusing on the text and the data, I guess. So I'm maybe pushing back a little bit on that. on that aspect of persuasion.
Somebody doesn't like touchy-feely and somebody needs a hug.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So the point is, we should use our mind and our heart. And I think as academics, we like to still use our mind, and I didn't hear you say otherwise.
Amen. Well said.